Hi everyone, Carl Steele here with my first video for English 3111 for fall 2022 in medieval English literature class. This is material we'll be covering in class on Monday and also on Wednesday, but I thought it might be helpful for you to have this in this environment as well. We're talking about Chaucer's poem, The Former Age, and also introducing to you some features of Middle English and its differences from Old English. So what I have here is a medieval manuscript image. This is from the 15th century. It's an illustration of part of a work called the Roman de la Rose, the Romance of the Rose. And down below, you have some text in French, which I've transcribed over here. Jadis au temps de premier père. That's a sort of old French pronunciation, long ago in the time of the first fathers, which is an illustration here of the golden age of the first era of human beings mythologically, where we all lived in peace with animals and with each other. And we will talk more about this a few slides later. But first, about the languages we'll be working on this semester. Well, Middle English is an old version of English. It is not technically Old English. This will be a little bit confusing for you at first, but Old English is a specific version of English, which emerges roughly around the year 650 as people who speak a Germanic language invade the island of Britain. They are called the Angles and the Saxons and the Jutes. And so some people call them the Anglo-Saxons, but really we can just say we know that they spoke a common language. And that language is now called Old English, and it lasts until roughly 1150 for reasons we can talk about further in class, or you can just look up the year 1066 and get a sense of why that language eventually is replaced by Middle English. Now, Old English is really, it's like learning another language. It's a Germanic language and has the features of a Germanic language, and learning how to read that is a class in itself. So here's a little bit of this from the Old English translation of Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy. This is translated out of Latin. La leo theich retka jo lustbelige song ich shall nu helt finde singen. The songs that I, an outcast, once sang joyfully, I must now sing grievingly, is a way to translate that. I was once singing happily, now I'm singing sadly. Now, Middle English is that language, Old English, with an enormously simplified grammar, which we can talk about in more detail in class. And mainly it doesn't have case endings. If you have Russian or if you have German, for example, Turkish, you know about case endings. And Latin, for example, Greek, Middle English loses almost all of those. It loses grammatical gender, and it has French come in and added to the vocabulary in a big way, and also some Norwegian and Danish as well. And this is a language that lasts from roughly 1150 to 1500. And here is an example of Middle English, which is the language we're going to be learning how to read in this class. And I'll read this to you. Io epinem constrained to begin in verse of sorrowful matera, that willum and flourish in studi me deletable dites. This is the same opening as I just read to you in Old English, but this is Middle English. This is from Geoffrey Chaucer, who's a late 14th century poet, probably the most important known poet in Middle English. He's translating primarily from the French, which is one of the several languages that he knew how to read, but also correcting that French with access to Latin. And so this means the same thing, more or less, as we just read in Old English, but you can see that it's a little bit easier to understand. I hope it is. I weeping, I'll read it with a modern English pronunciation. I weeping am constrained to begin verse of sorrowful matter, who once in flourishing study made delightful ditties. Okay, so it's not going to be impossible for you to learn how to read this stuff. But again, Middle English, while an old version of English, is not Old English. And there are later writers whom you might think of as speaking an old version of English. It is an old version of English, but it's not technically Old English. And these are writers like Shakespeare, Afra Ben, Olaudah Equiano, Samuel Johnson, for example, or writing something called early modern English, which lasts from roughly 1500 to 1800. And then from 1800 to the present, we have modern English in all its varieties, which are considerable. So talk about this, of course, in much more detail in class, but now let's go into the poem itself. I'm going to talk about the first stanza in this video, Chaucer's Former Age, the first stanza. This is a poem from probably, I'm going to call it the 1380s, maybe the 1370s, maybe a little later. And here's how it goes in Middle English. A blissful leaf, a paceable and a sueta, led in the peplus in the former age. They hailed him paid of the fruits that they ate, which that they failed as Yahweh be as age. They were not for pampered with outrage, and known was the quern and eke the mella. They ate in mast hours and switch ponage, and drunken water of the cold awella. So you will notice some things about the pronunciation there. I'm pronouncing every single letter, number one. Number two, the vowels are pronounced in the way that vowels are pronounced in continental European languages, like the vowels are pronounced in French or Spanish or Italian or German, for example. That changes in the 16th century in something that's amusingly called the Great Vowel Shift. So Shakespeare's vowels are going to be pronounced in a different way than Chaucer's vowels. And there are just some interesting grammatical features which I'll talk about in the next slide. But let's just talk about the rhyme scheme here. This is an A, B, A, B, B, C, B, C rhyme scheme. Sueta, eta, age, usage, outrage, punage, mela, wella. So that's how we can map that rhyme scheme. This is based on a French stanzaic form called the ballade. So even though Chaucer is called in the 15th century, very shortly after his death, basically the father of English literature, he is, in many of his most famous poems, borrowing from French methods. The language of poetry in this period is absolutely international and multilinguistic. We are not in a period of linguistic monotony, basically. Even the so-called father of English poetry is drawing on multiple language traditions. They're talking to each other. It's an international world, and one that's not very friendly, say, to Brexit. The form of this, the stanzaic, the metrical form, it's close to iambic pentameter. So if you have Shakespeare classes, you're familiar with iambic pentameter, but really with Chaucer, it's better to think in terms of 4 or 5 emphasized or stressed syllables per line, which alternate with unstressed syllables, because it's not really regular iambic pentameter. It's not, if you try to read it that way, it's just not going to work. But if you think in terms of stressed syllables, it will work. And so here's an example of a line where I've capitalize the stressed syllables, a blissful leaf, a paceable, and a sueta. So that's an example of showing how that works. You can see how it alternates stressed and unstressed, but not regularly in the way that, say, Shakespeare's poetry often does. It's mostly 10 syllables per line. Some of them are 11 or 12, but again, if we think in terms of stresses, we don't get too worried about that. So let's talk about the grammatical features. This is going to be a lot of detail, but I want to just show you some of the richness of how we can talk about this stuff. So in line 1, a blissful leaf, a paceable, and a sueta, we have 3 adjectives: blissful, paceable, sueta, all adjectives. They all go with the noun life, right? So just notice that the way that's organized, right? And think about how that affects you as you read it when you encounter the word blissful, happy first, and then peaceful and sweet later on to the line. How does that unroll for you as a reader as you're going through it? Notice this word, this verb leden. That's a third person plural conjugation of the verb. Note the en ending. That's a very common form of representing that. A conjugation of a verb is the way that that verb changes according to the number, really. So like in English, we have I am, you are, he is. That's a conjugation, right? That verb changes form according to whether it's I, whether it's you, whether it's he, whether it's they, and so on. English doesn't have a lot of irregular verbs anymore, but some languages do have a fair number of irregular verbs. French does, for example. Spanish does, for example. And Old English certainly had it. Middle English had some irregular verbs, more perhaps than we do in modern English, but that gradually simplifies. So what's the subject here? Well, I've underlined it, people. The subject is reserved really quite late into the sentence, into this sentence. A happy life, peaceable and sweet life led the people of the former age. That what kind of life did they lead? Blissful, peaceable, sweet. Then in line 3, we have the pronoun hem. This is the southern form of the pronoun. In the north, they wrote this pronoun as them. So Chaucer lives in the south. He lives in London. He writes the London form of Middle English. People in the north are writing those pronouns with a th ending instead of an h ending. They gradually, enough people move from the north into London, into the 15th century, and so on, that common pronoun form changes. So immigrants bring their form of English south with them, and the people in the south gradually change their way of speaking in response to that. So now we say in modern English, they and them instead of him, for example. So this is a dialectical difference. There are many, many dialects of Middle English, just as there are dialects of modern English. And indeed, Middle English is much more dialectically varied than modern English. It's one of the things that makes it kind of difficult and exciting to work with. Line 4, which that. You're going to encounter phrases like that often in Middle English, and I'm going to try to warn you off them. They're basically just metrical fillers. It just means which. That you will often see that word that added. The most famous line of Middle English poetry, "When that April with its sure suta," when April with its sweet showers, begins with just such a metrical filler. When that. Okay, so line 4, yav. You'll often encounter that Y there, where you might expect a modern English G, for example. What this is representing is, in fact, an obsolete letter, something that's called a yoh, and it looks like a kind of a number 3, and it's pronounced more or less like it sounds. So you might say it like, the veld is yav him, biazaj, like a h sound. We don't really have that in modern English anymore, but of course many languages have that guttural sound, Arabic, for example. They were not for pampered with utraj. Middle English has got a couple things going on in terms of negations. Sometimes you have stuff that's very much like French, which has, if you know French, you know that to negate something, if you want to say, I don't know, you would say je ne sais pas, or to slow that down, je ne sais pas, or ne and pas together make up the negation, and they surround the verb say. And so here we have ne not. It's almost like it's French. But in Middle English, you can also make negatives by simply adding them up. You can have double, triple, quadruple uses of negations just to really emphasize things. Of course, there are many versions of English nowadays that do that as well. African-American vernacular English does this. So this is not a grammatical fault. It is simply a feature of how English operates. And that so-called standard English lost this along the way, but other forms of English, AAVA, maintains this. So is this French? Is this possibly? It's a little bit of French in this case. For pampered, you'll often see that word for, and it's an obsolete use of the prefix for. We don't encounter this in modern English, except in old words like forbid, but it can be a negation, or it can be a way to emphasize that this particular word is especially bad. To be floor pampered is to be especially excessively delighted by something. So eek is a word you're going to encounter a lot in Middle English. So I'm going to start compiling words that you just want to know because you're going to encounter them a lot. If you know German, you will probably recognize that this is a form of the word auch, also. Eek means also in Middle English. It's very, very close to the German word. Switch is another one of these words you'll encounter often. It's just such. It's just such. So such panache. So what kind of poem is this? A blissful life of Hesiod and a suede laid in the pepless in the former age. To put it briefly, and again, I'll cover this in more detail in class. This is a poem about the Golden Age. It's about this period of the earliest period of human history, which we find described in classical poetry and work by Hesiod or by Ovid, for example, that imagines that when we all first emerged as human beings, we lived together in absolute harmony. We drank water. We didn't engage in trade. There was no exploitation. There was no meat eating. We were all vegetarian. We ate only the stuff that we can just gather from trees or from the fields. And everyone just got along. And then gradually things got worse. We transitioned from the Golden Age eventually into the Iron Age, which is a period of war, and the one that we live in now. So although myths of the former age are quite different. Oftentimes nowadays we have people who practice something called paleo, which tries to imagine that early humans were all carnivores. We have in the Middle Ages and the classical period a very, very different imagining of what it was that humans were in the earliest days. We encounter this as well in the Bible, in the second creation story. Humans get along peaceably with animals, and in fact humans do not eat meat in the Bible until Genesis chapter 9, after the flood. So there's also a kind of golden age story in the Bible itself. So here's a representation from an early modern painting, a Renaissance painting, in fact, of the Golden Age. This is at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, just a detail from it. Okay. So the big question, this is the last slide, and this is something we can talk about in much more detail probably on Wednesday, is what is Chaucer's attitude towards these people? In the most obvious sense, as you read through this, he's going to be saying, this is what people were like in the former age, that there was no violence, there's no cruelty, tyrants didn't want to conquer them because they didn't have any money, so there was no purpose in conquering them. And now we live in a time when it's just pure betrayal and murder, and everyone's trying to stab each other in the back. You may think that the good old days were great, but in fact, if you look at what people said in the good old days, they were just as nostalgic for the good old days as we are in the present day. Nostalgia is a continuous feature of human existence, that people always believe that a couple of hundred years ago, things were much better. And that's not necessarily the case for every human group, but that consistency of nostalgia is something that you're going to encounter repeatedly. Chaucer's attitude seems to be, on this quite simple reading, very, very admiring of these people, saying that they are wonderful people, except when we get to that word panache. So if you look in the Middle English Dictionary, which is a free resource, which is available online, and which you'll be using very frequently throughout this semester, you will find, if you look at the word panache, here's one of the spelling of it, panache. It says acorn. Acorns are food that pigs eat in the forest when pigs are driven out in the forest to fatten themselves to be slaughtered. Mast haws and panache are basically tree food, and that is what people of the Golden Age eat. But when you describe it using panache, you're describing it as also the food that pigs eat. And we can ask why that is and what effect it has on the reader, and we will talk about that in a lot more detail on Wednesday, but I think it provides a much more complicated picture of Chaucer's attitude than you might get from a first reading. So thank you for listening. I'm looking forward to meeting you tomorrow.